So today we're going to be talking about foundation stories. So we'll continue talking about the story of Aeneas and his men who come from Troy to Italy, and then what happens. So we'll start by looking at Aeneas and Turnus. So Aeneas thinks that he's going to live happily ever after in Laurentum with his men, but things don't quite play out that way. And then we'll look at the descendants of Aeneas, who are the kings of Alba Longa. And then finally, the stories of Romulus, Remus, and the foundation of Rome. So first, Aeneas and Turnus. So as you remember from the last lecture, Aeneas has made peace with the local population in Laurentum with King Latinus. He's married Lavinia and is set up to live happily ever after. Now having founded a kind of second Troy in Italy. But things are not going to be that easy. Turnus, who's a prince of the Rutulians, another Italic tribe living nearby Laurentum, and who was actually a suitor of Lavinia's, so one of the men that's courting Lavinia and hoping to marry her, probably not so much because he just thought Lavinia was really cute and nice, but because he was hoping that through this marriage he would in fact get control of the city of Laurentum. Well, Turnus isn't so happy about Aeneas coming into the picture and taking Lavinia. He's in fact very angry, and he responds by forming an alliance with an Etruscan king. So one of these kings of an Etruscan city to the north of Rome, a city that was probably not so happy with seeing cities to the south prospering, and Turnus decides this is a good opportunity to form an alliance with somebody that also would like to see Laurentum go down. The king's name is Mezentius. So Turnus and Mezentius then team up against Aeneas and the Latins. They fight a very difficult battle. It goes in each direction several times, but eventually Aeneas and the Latins defeat Turnus and Mezentius. And the story of this battle is actually what makes up the second half of Virgil's Aeneid, where he tells the story of Aeneas and his men coming to Laurentum, making peace, well, first making war and then making peace with Latinus, and then fighting with Turnus and Mezentius, eventually ending in the death of Turnus. Aeneas himself also seems to die at some point in this battle, although we're not really told anything about the circumstances. Livy just sort of mentions that, oh, by the way, Aeneas dies too. And this means that Aeneas' son Ascanius is left without a father, and in fact, Lavinia now is left to be a kind of placeholder ruler until Ascanius comes of age. How this exactly played out, we have no idea. It's also interesting that in Livy we're told that there are kind of two different versions of Ascanius' parentage. So in one version, he's actually the son of Aeneas' first wife, a Trojan woman named Creusa, who Aeneas very famously just leaves behind in burning Troy. She's sort of part of the entourage that's trying to escape the city, and at some point she falls off and Aeneas never turns around to get her. He makes sure that he carries his father out on his shoulders, but, well, his wife just kind of ends up disappearing. But, you know, this is par for the course when we're talking about the Greco-Roman culture. In another version, Ascanius is actually the son of Lavinia. So whether Ascanius is the stepson or the biological son of Lavinia, we're told by Livy that Lavinia kind of acts as a placeholder until Ascanius is old enough to become king, to replace his father as king of now the Latins, what this people of Laurentum called themselves. But Ascanius, for reasons that are not, again, entirely clear, decides that rather than be king of Laurentum, he's actually going to found his own city, Alba Longa. And Alba Longa is about 12 miles southeast of Rome. Why he does this, we don't know. Presumably it has something has happened that has made it difficult for him to seize control of being of the kingship, of ruling these people, probably because in Aeneas's absence now someone else has stepped in, despite what Livy says about Lavinia trying to hold on for Ascanius. So here we have a painting that depicts this very famous scene from the end of Virgil's Aeneid, where he's talking about the death of Turnus at the hands of Aeneas. And so you have pictured here Aeneas standing over Turnus, and Aeneas holding the sword that he's about to drive through Turnus, and Turnus on the ground sort of pleading for mercy. And Aeneas showing none of this. And this is a moment in Virgil's Aeneid that's been really hotly debated. Should Aeneas have actually spared Turnus's life? And what does it mean that he didn't? How are we supposed to interpret that action, given that Aeneas is the founding ancestor of the Romans and of ruling Romans, particularly when we get to the empire and we're talking about Augustus and his descendants? They trace their ancestry back to Aeneas. So what does it mean that Augustus's ancestor Aeneas does not show mercy to Turnus? And this is something that scholars like to talk about and try to interpret. But the end result is that Turnus is slaughtered at the hands of Aeneas, and Virgil very graphically talks about this story. So Ascanius goes to Alba Longa. He founds a new settlement where he now is the uncontested king and rules in peace and harmony as far as we can tell. And his descendants are known as the Silvian Kings. In Latin, a silva was a forest. So they're sort of the forest kings. Almost, you think almost of nymphs when you think of this. But why they're known as this? They all take the name Silvus as part of their name, and so hence the Silvian Kings. But all of them are descended from Ascanius, and the kingship passes down from father to eldest son, so it's hereditary. Well, the result of this is that for generations it works fine, but eventually, not unexpectedly, a younger son decides he doesn't like this system and decides that he's going to seize the kingship from his older brother. So Amulius, the younger brother, seizes the kingship from Numitor, the rightful heir, and sends Numitor into exile. He doesn't kill him, he just sends him into exile, and that's an important fact to keep in mind as we proceed. He does, in fact, kill, we're told, all of Numitor's sons, presumably so that the sons will not then try to retake the kingship for their father. But he allows his daughter, Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to live, but he forces her into virginity. He makes her what's called a Vestal Virgin. And the Vestal Virgins were a cult of women, usually sort of very young girls, around the ages of about 7 or 8, were committed to this cult, and and it was an honor. It was something that elite families sort of begged for the chance for their daughters to do. And they lived a life of virginity and looked after the hearth. They were in charge of sort of the safety, in a symbolic way, the safety of the city. And the cult originates, in fact, in Alba Longa and then is taken to Rome later, and it persists all the way through into the 4th century AD. But Rhea Silvia is forced into this life of virginity so that she will not produce offspring that, again, will challenge Amulius's claim to power. Unfortunately, something goes wrong with this, and Rhea Silvia is impregnated. She shows up pregnant. Now, in the picture that just showed up on your screen, on the left side of the slide, we have represented here one story that explains Rhea Silvia's pregnancy, and that is that she was raped by the god Mars. And so you have Mars in his cape with his sword threatening the poor maiden who is looking askance and scared and frightened, and the little sort of Cupid-like nymph trying to kind of get in between the two. But however she exactly got impregnated. One can assume or maybe guess that perhaps she just snuck out in the middle of the night and met her boyfriend, and, well, one thing led to the other. But she ends up pregnant. The story is that she was visited by Mars and he impregnates her, and she gives birth to twins. So Rhea Silvia gives birth to twins, but not unexpectedly, Amulius isn't too happy about this, and he sentences these twins to drown. So here you see the twins sort of down in the frieze here on your screen. But Amulius sentences the twins to drown, and he entrusts the task to some of his loyal servants. It's a great example of why you should never entrust important tasks to other people, because these servants are kind of lazy and they don't really, perhaps they're reluctant to actually commit murder. Whatever the reason, they decide when the Tiber River has overflown its banks, and so you have, not just the river, but now water flowing sort of outside the banks. You have floodwaters. And they decide that rather than actually make the effort of walking through the floodwaters and drowning the twins, or at least putting them in the river itself where they're likely to fall out of their baskets or whatever and drown, they place them on the floodwaters. And so when the floodwaters recede, of course, the twins are still alive. And the story is that they're actually found initially by a she-wolf. And that's who suckles them. So you can imagine, it's been a few days since they've eaten, they're really hungry, and the she-wolf comes along and the twins grab onto her teats and start sucking. And so here we have the twins being suckled by the she-wolf. Romulus and Remus had a kind of interesting boyhood. Despite their royal blood, they were eventually found sort of after the she-wolf had suckled them. They're found by a shepherd and raised by this shepherd and his wife. But it's not the sort of best household, shall we say. His wife may have been a prostitute, we're told by Livy, and they, as parents, the shepherd and his wife, seem to not be entirely up to the task. And Romulus and Remus end up really just turning into teenage hooligans. Livy tells us that one of their favorite things to do is go on cattle raids and steal cattle from their neighbors. You can imagine that they're not the most popular teenagers in town. Eventually, Remus is arrested for his cattle raiding activities. So he shows up at a festival and is hauled in and taken initially to King Amulius, and then somehow, we're not told exactly how, ends up in the hands of Numitor. And Numitor recognizes eventually that this hooligan that is in his control is in fact his grandson, and is somebody of royal blood. And Romulus then fills him in and says, oh yes, this is, I'm the other half, and let's come up with a plot and restore you, Numitor, to your rightful throne. And so the three of them concoct a plot that eventually results in the murder of Amulius and the restoration of Numitor as the king of Alba Longa. And here on your right you have another very, very famous bronze statue of the twins being suckled by the she-wolf. And you can actually go see this statue in the Capitoline Museum. It was made in the middle of the Roman Republic, partly as a way for reinforcing Roman sense of their descendants from Romulus and Remus, from this mythological pair of twins. And so this bronze statue was set up, and Romans could view it and be reminded of their origins. But it's survived for us and is quite a wonder to view if you get a chance to go to Rome. So Romulus and Remus, having restored their grandfather to the throne of Alba Longa, decide that they don't really want to stick around and wait for Grandpa to die and then take over in Alba Longa. They're restless. So they decide that they want to found a new city. And they want to found this city on the site where they were left to drown. And so they travel to the area which is now Rome, and decide that, you know, this is going to be where we found our city, on the banks of the Tiber River. But there's a lot of disagreement between the two about who should be king. There are two of them, and that doesn't work so well for monarchy, and it never occurs to them that, well, maybe we should have an oligarchy, maybe we should share rule, maybe we should trade off, or we should work in tandem, as later in the Republic the Roman consuls will do. But in fact, they fight over who's going to be king. And again, sort of, you know, this is not unexpected given their somewhat unusual upbringing. So they decide that they're going to turn to augury. They're going to rely on the will of the gods to determine who's going to be the next king, or who is going to be the king of this new city. And augury is just using the birds and bird flight to determine this. And it's a practice that actually comes to Rome from Etruria. A lot of different arts of soothsaying are actually native to Etruria, but come into Rome eventually, and augury is a big one. So they determine that we're going to go see what signs the gods send us through the birds. So Remus goes on to the top of the Aventine Hill, Romulus to the top of the Palatine Hill. And they wait, and they wait. And eventually, Remus sees 6 vultures, and he thinks, that's it, I'm going to be the king. And he's all excited about this. Except that Romulus then sees 12 vultures. So then they fight again, and they didn't determine ahead of time what was going to be the sign. Was it going to be who saw a sign first, or who saw the most? So they still haven't really resolved who's going to be king. And this quarrel gets bitter when Romulus decides that he's just going to start building a wall. And that's going to be, he's going to build a wall around the Palatine, and that's going to be his city. And Remus decides to mock him and starts jumping over his wall, saying, haha, look at how easy it is to get into your city. And of course this makes Romulus furious, but rather than, you know, walk away and take a deep breath, he kills his brother. So in a sense, you see here the genetic inheritance of Aeneas at work, where Aeneas couldn't hold back on his rage, and he kills Turnus. He doesn't spare Turnus. But here it's enacted in an even more problematic situation, where it's brother against brother. And so already from the beginnings of Rome, in its mythic origins, we have this myth of fratricide weaved into it. And this is going to permeate Roman culture all the way to the end, where they're always aware that at this originary moment, at this moment of foundation, the city was founded on a moment of fratricide, 2 brothers who couldn't get along. And when this comes up again, particularly at times of civil war, it's a time when Romans really sort of reflect on the story of Romulus and Remus and what it means for them. The end result, though, is Remus is dead and Romulus is the first king of Rome. And this now inaugurates what we call the regal period of Roman history. So a little bit about Romulus's Rome. As I said, it was based on the Palatine Hill. This was sort of his center. And it had a lot of Etruscan influence, according to Livy. So some of the different ways, beyond the fact that augury played an important part in its foundation, is just the notion that the king has a chair that he sits in that is sacred. This is very much Etruscan. And just in sort of general, the use of what are called lictors, but a kind of bodyguard that protects the king is also considered Etruscan as well. But several other factors that Livy talks about in your reading, where there seems to be some Etruscan influence already at the foundation moment of Rome. The date of foundation, or the birthday of Rome, was established very late in the late Republic, so about 50 BC, 700 years after the fact. But it's the date that we now, just sort of out of tradition, celebrate as Rome's birthday, the 21st of April, 753 BC. And Romulus consecrates the city, that is, he makes the city holy with a sacrifice of oxen to Hercules. And this is actually drawing on an Italic influence. So you have this kind of mix of Etruscan influence and native Italic influence. But he makes the sacrifice of oxen to Hercules, and this then explains to later Romans why Hercules is a guardian deity of the city. In creating the city, he establishes what is called the Pomerium. This is the sacred boundary of the city, and it's an important boundary line. Certain activities cannot happen inside the boundary line. Military generals are not allowed to enter, to cross that Pomerium while they're still holding imperium or power. They have to give up that power. So it becomes then this sort of space that is sacred, that you can only do certain things in it. You can't bury dead in it. There are laws about building houses in it, and so forth. And it remains the same throughout Roman history. It does get expanded under Sulla, but you still have this kind of central, almost kind of downtown area that is Rome itself. And sort of legally, everything outside the Pomerium is not Rome, even if we call it Rome. Legally and in a legal context, it's actually not. And so, and sort of the important thing to know about the Pomerium is just that beyond kind of establishing a sacred boundary, it dictates what can and cannot be done inside of that space. Romulus is also credited with enacting laws. Now, in general, his Rome was pretty lawless. It was a kind of a gang of boys that were, like him, teenage hooligans. But we're told that he, at least sort of in an attempt to civilize them, did enact some laws to try to kind of create a sense of communal identity. He created a senate of 100 fathers. These are the Latin word for fathers, patres. And this is where our word patrician comes from. And the important thing about this original senate that Romulus creates, besides the fact that it establishes the model of having a monarch but an advisory body of the Senate, so not terribly different from the way that we have a president and then a Senate, and neither one can act entirely independent of the other. The other important thing about this original Senate is that these 100 men serve as the ancestors of the patricians. And all the way 800, 900 years later, 1,000 years later, you'll still have Romans claiming descendancy from the patricians, claiming that they are patricians. And that's an important social distinction, and it plays an important role, particularly as we get into the late Republic and beyond. And so we'll be returning to this idea of this original 100 senators. There's only one really big problem with Romulus's Rome. There were several problems, but one really big, significant one that was going to prevent it from really prospering. There are no women there. So this is something that Romulus has to try to come up with a solution, and in class we'll be talking about what his solution eventually is when we talk about the rape of the Sabine women.